The winter of 1847 came to Milbrook, Vermont, like a living thing determined to bury the town alive. The Green Mountains closed in around the settlement, sealing it from the outside world beneath a constant barrage of wind and snow. That February, a blizzard rolled down from the high peaks with a cruelty even the oldest residents could not recall. It swallowed sound, blurred the horizon into a seamless wall of white, and snuffed out the lives of 17 people across Windham County before the storm loosened its grip. When it was over, the survivors spoke of one figure who had walked out of that storm not with the dazed stagger of the nearly frozen, but with a steady, purposeful stride. His name, he said, was Samuel Hawthorne, yet no census, church ledger, or court record from before that night bore any trace of such a man. It was as though the blizzard had conjured him from the snow itself. Milbrook in those days was small, barely 300 souls, most of them farmers, loggers, and their families eking out a living from stubborn, frost-hardened land. The nearest, larger town lay a day's ride away, connected only by roads that winter turned into deadly traps. Founded in 1789 by Revolutionary War veterans, Milbrook had long been forgotten by the rest of Vermont, a gap in the map where nothing much happened, and nothing much changed. But that season change arrived, wearing a heavy coat of strange hide. With eyes like ice over deep water, Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, the town's Harvard-educated physician, had been keeping grim notes in his journal all winter, whiskey freezing in bottles left indoors overnight, the Connecticut River locked solid to a depth of 4 feet, firewood dwindling faster than it could be cut. Henrik Bergstrom, a Norwegian woodsman who had survived Arctic Circle winters, declared it the most merciless season he had ever endured. Food stores ran low, medical supplies dwindled to dregs, and still the snow kept falling at worse. Into this desperation that young Timothy Prescott, son of the town's general storekeeper, spotted the lone figure moving down the mountain trail in the midst of the storm. At first, the boy thought the wind was playing tricks, sculpting a man from snow, but the shape did not dissolve. It drew nearer, each step deliberate. Most travelers in such a storm would wander aimlessly until they fell. This man moved as though he carried a map no one else could see. Word spread quickly. Within minutes, half the able-bodied men in town were gathered at the store's rear windows, watching him advance through wind that bent the trees nearly flat. Hawthorne came upright against the gale, his gait steady, his pace unhurried. His appearance was unlike anything the townsfolk had seen. The outer garment he wore was fashioned from a treated animal hide, yet the texture was strange thick, almost armor-like, and impervious to the snow that slid off it without melting. Beneath it, layers of woven fabric shimmered faintly, catching the light like metal threads. His boots left deep, patterned impressions in the snow, studded with odd metal shapes that no one recognized. Later, Dr. Putnam would sketch these tracks, noting that they matched no design from Europe or New England. When Hawthorne reached the store, the townspeople saw the first unsettling fact about him. Though he claimed to have been walking for many days, he bore none of the damage winter inflicts on the flesh. His fingers and toes were whole. His cheeks, though red from the cold, showed no frostbite. His voice was steady, his movements fluid. He stood well over 6 feet, lean but powerfully built, his dark hair streaked prematurely with white. His face was all angles, high cheekbones, sharp nose, a mouth that rarely gave away more than a calculated half-smile. But it was his eyes people remembered, pale, almost without color, and fixed on each person as though measuring their worth. When he spoke, it was imperfect English, though with an accent that refused to be placed. Not quite British, not quite German, but something older, worn smooth by travel. His vocabulary was precise, yet peppered with words that seemed ancient or strange. Asked where he came from, he would only say, beyond the great peaks, where the sun falls differently, and the old ways are still kept. That night, the townspeople gathered in the warm common room of Abigail Forestk's Inn outside. The wind howled. Inside, Hawthorne sat by the fire with a mug of coffee. His leather satchel never left his side. When Sarah Thornbury, the eldest daughter of Milbrook's most prosperous farming family, began coughing a persistent, rattling sound that had worried Dr. Putnam for weeks, Hawthorne listened intently. Without hesitation, he drew a small vial from his satchel, filled with a dark liquid that smelled of pine and something sweet but unplaceable. 3 drops in warm water, he instructed. Within an hour, Sarah's coughing eased. By morning she was breathing easily. The news traveled faster than any storm. By the next evening, half the town had come to the inn seeking Hawthorne's remedies. Even Dr. Putnam, skeptical at first, found himself grudgingly impressed. Hawthorne diagnosed with uncanny speed, prescribed herbs that should have been impossible to find under snow and produced cures that worked. Still, questions lingered. His satchel seemed bottomless, its contents a mystery. His boots left no snowmelt, and his eyes always those pale, measuring eyes watched not just people's faces, but their homes, their stores of food, the layout of the streets, as if committing the whole of Milbrook to memory. In those first days, no one guessed what he truly carried with him. They would learn soon enough. The storm that had delivered Samuel Hawthorne to Milbrook did not loosen its grip. Snow continued to drift in high, wind-hardened ridges across the narrow streets. Rooflines groaned under its weight. Inside the inn, the stranger had taken a small room in the corner, the kind travelers used when passing through in gentler seasons. He paid no coin. Abigail Foresk, the widowed innkeeper, waved away the matter. Sarah Thornberry's recovery had been worth more than silver. Dr. Ezekiel Putnam found himself watching Hawthorne with a professional curiosity that teetered between admiration and unease. His own medicine chest was nearly bare, laudanum down to its last drop, quinine jar scraped clean. Yet Hawthorne treated patients as if his supplies were endless. His satchel was always at his side, heavy with bottles of powders and liquids, wrapped bundles of herbs, and small instruments unlike any Dr. Putnam had seen. There were blades with curves meant for cutting in ways that seemed more suited to a butcher's block than a sick room. There were powders whose scents were unfamiliar even to a man trained in Boston's best. Apothecaries. On the third day after his arrival, Hawthorne cured a logger's infected wound, using a thick paste that smelled faintly of resin and something metallic. Within hours, the swelling diminished, the angry red streaks fading toward pink. A simple matter, Hawthorne told Putnam, if one understands how the body's own nature can be turned in its favor. Yet for all his successes, the man's presence unsettled some. Grace Thornberry, whose gratitude for her daughter's recovery was deep, nevertheless wrote unsent letters to her sister in Albany. In them, she described how Hawthorne slept no more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, often waking to sit motionless at the window, eyes fixed on the snowbound darkness. Sometimes he vanished into the storm for hours, returning with strange cuts of fresh meat when every hunter in town swore no game had been seen for weeks. The meat was always expertly butchered, portioned with precision. Hawthorne claimed it came from rabbits or deer taken in the high forests, but to seasoned hunters, the bone structure and texture seemed wrong. Dr. Putnam began to notice other patterns. Patients treated by Hawthorne recovered quickly, yes, but they also developed an unusual hunger for meat. In a town where preserved beans and root vegetables were the winter's main diet, this craving stood out. Some became protective territorial over their food stores. And then there were the dreams. Several townsfolk spoke quietly of vivid nightmares, white landscapes stretching to the horizon, shadowed figures calling from the edges, whispering in unknown tongues about a sacred feast. They always woke hungry. The turning point for Putnam came when he examined one of Hawthorne's powdered remedies under his microscope. Among the plant fibers, he found something hard, bone fragments, and not from deer or rabbit. The structure was unmistakably human. There was hair, too, fine and dark. When Putnam confronted him, Hawthorne's pale eyes lit with something like approval. "You've looked closely," he said, voice even. "Good. The most powerful medicines," he continued, "are drawn from the human body itself. Prepared properly, they heal more completely than anything else. In my homeland, we understand that all meat, all bone, is the same in purpose to give life when life is needed." Putnam felt the room grow smaller around him. "You're feeding human remains to these people," he managed. "I am feeding them survival," Hawthorne corrected, his words measured, deliberate, "and in doing so, I prepare them for a truth your civilization fears, that the boundaries you cling to are luxuries of the well-fed." The doctor left that exchange with his pulse hammering, his mind torn between disbelief and the evidence, in his own hands. He began keeping detailed notes not just on Hawthorne's cures, but on the behaviors of those who had taken them. Meanwhile, Grace Thornberry made her own discoveries. One morning, she passed Hawthorne's open door and saw him polishing a silver locket. It was delicate, floral in pattern, and instantly familiar. She had last seen it around the neck of Rebecca Henley, a merchant's wife who had vanished with her husband on the road to Albany before the first snows. The searchers had found nothing, not even their wagon. When Grace asked, Hawthorne said it had belonged to a dear friend from home, whose spirit travels with me. His smile was almost gentle. At night, strange sounds seeped from his room, scraping, muffled cries, and once, what Grace swore was quiet humming to a tune she couldn't place. The true scale of the stranger's nature was revealed not by the doctor or by Grace, but by young Timothy Prescott. Exploring the woods behind the Thornbury farm, he found a snow-hidden entrance to what looked like a collapsed mine shaft. Clearing the drift, he uncovered a chamber lined with hides like the material of Hawthorne's coat. Inside were bundles of all sizes, some blood-stained, cut as though from their owners. There were trinkets, rings, watches, children's toys, prayer books, but worse still were the drawings, anatomical sketches, human and animal alike, marked with precise notes about cutting, preserving, and preparing flesh. And there was a journal. Its careful script described expeditions in the mountains, encounters with travelers, and the processing of their remains. Human flesh, the author wrote, was the most nutritionally complete resource available, and, when introduced in small doses, it dismantled the civilized aversion to its consumption. Timothy ran to his father. Jeremiah Prescott, practical man though he was, could not explain away what they found. He brought the evidence to Dr. Putnam. The doctor's fears solidified into certainty. Samuel Hawthorne was not simply a traveler. With unusual cures he was conditioning Milbrook to accept cannibalism. The cravings, the dreams, the strange unity among his patients, it was all part of a deliberate process. The question now was how to act against a man the town saw as a savior. Jeremiah Prescott had always considered himself a careful man. As the owner of Milbrook's only general store, he kept meticulous ledgers, every transaction, every delivery, every rumor worth noting. That habit now felt like a burden. In the quiet hours before dawn, by the light of a single oil lamp, he read and reread the entries in the journal Timothy had found in the hidden cave. It was Hawthorne's handwriting, there could be no doubt. Every stroke was the same as the maps and lists the stranger had shown him weeks earlier. But here, the careful penmanship told a story that left Jeremiah's stomach hollow. The author wrote not of healing, but of harvesting. He described stalking travelers through the high passes, sometimes following them for days before approaching. His strategy was always the same: arrive in a moment of crisis, offer help, guide them to shelter, and wait for the storm to finish the work. Then came the field preservation, a term repeated often, always with notes on temperature, blood drainage, and cuts for optimal storage. One entry described a family of 5, caught in an early snow. Hawthorne, though he used no name for himself in the text, had led them to a narrow canyon from which escape was improbable. The next pages read like a butcher's manual, not a diary. The tone was not emotional, not remorseful, but efficient. By the time Jeremiah set the book down, his hands were trembling. He had no doubt now that the man living under Grace Thornberry's roof had killed many times, and that Milbrook itself was becoming his next long-term project. He took the journal to Dr. Putnam, who had been keeping his own detailed notes. Together they pored over it, cross-referencing the dates with disappearances in the surrounding counties. The pattern was unmistakable. Families, lone travelers, hunting parties, gone without trace, often in winter, always in places Hawthorne could have reached. And the names, they recognized some from trade records and church registers: Rebecca and James Henley, a party of loggers. From Chesterfield, a merchant's apprentice from Brattleboro. The realization that some of those missing might have already fed the town made Jeremiah feel physically ill. "We can't go to the people with this yet," Putnam said, closing the journal with more force than was necessary. Not without more proof. His influence is too deep. Some might defend him. Jeremiah thought of the way people now spoke of Hawthorne, how they deferred to him, how his opinion seemed to carry more weight than the reverence, he thought. Of the cravings, the way Sarah Thornbury's eyes had changed. "What about the Reverend?" Jeremiah asked. Putnam hesitated. "Perhaps, but first we need to know how far this has gone." Over the next week, the two men watched quietly, collecting details. They noticed which households had been given Hawthorne's medicines, which families had begun speaking in his phrases, talk of waste being the only sin, of the mountain providing what it chooses. Meanwhile, Prescott used his merchant contacts to dig into old stories from neighboring towns. What he learned chilled him further. In 1844, a man calling himself Samuel Thorne had appeared in Grafton during a diphtheria outbreak. Dozens survived under his care. When spring came, several families vanished with him. In 1845, Samuel Blackthorne had saved a community in New Hampshire from starvation, only to disappear when officials began asking questions. Each time, the pattern was the same: arrival in a crisis, medical miracles, then disappearances. It was clear Milbrook was only the latest in a long trail. While Jeremiah dug through trade gossip, Dr. Putnam turned his medical curiosity into investigation. Using what little equipment he had left, he tested several of Hawthorne's remedies. The results were worse than expected. Alongside human tissue, the powders contained compounds that could alter brain chemistry, compounds that heightened dependency, dulled moral judgment, and made the user more receptive to suggestion. This explained the cravings, the shared dreams, the sudden shift in behavior among Hawthorne's patients. It was not just psychology, it was chemical conditioning. When Putnam confronted Hawthorne a second time, the man did not deny it. Instead, he seemed almost eager to explain. "You speak of morality," Dr. Hawthorne said, seated by the fire with that unsettling calm. "But morality is a construct for the comfortable in the true wilderness. Only efficiency matters. The human body contains everything needed to sustain another. We waste so much because we fear the truth." Putnam's voice was tight. "That survival is the only virtue," Hawthorne said, leaning forward. "That the weak sustain the strong, and in doing so, their existence gains purpose. My work here is to free your people from the illusions that keep them vulnerable." Putnam left feeling the walls of the town closing in. He and Prescott agreed they needed allies, and quickly. Reverend Greenfield was the first they approached. The minister's stern face grew paler with every word as they laid out the evidence. "This is blasphemy," he said when they finished. "If even half of what you say is true—" "It's all true," Putnam interrupted, "and he's not finished." Greenfield agreed to help, but warned that exposing Hawthorne would be dangerous. His influence had already wrapped itself around many in the congregation. By early March, the town was showing signs of transformation. The cravings had spread. Children played hunting games with disturbing accuracy, acting out the butchering of imaginary prey. Strangers were watched with a predator's calculation. The moment that forced action came from within the Thornberry household. Grace's youngest, Mary, began waking in the night to gnaw on raw salt pork in the cellar. When Grace tried to take it away, the 80-year-old actually growled and snapped at her hand. That same week, Thomas Thornberry caught Hawthorne in the barn by candlelight, working over a piece of meat. It was pale, fine-grained, unmistakably human. Around him lay organs in labeled jars, each marked with the same strange symbols from the journal. When Thomas confronted him, Hawthorne spoke, without shame. "This was the traveler from last week," he said evenly. "Dying when I found him. I made sure nothing went to waste. Your daughter's medicine came from him, that's why she recovered so well." "You're feeding my family human flesh," Thomas whispered. "I am feeding them life," Hawthorne replied, "and in time they will thank me for freeing them from the chains of your false morality." That night, Thomas went to the Reverend, to Prescott, to Putnam. The line had been crossed. It was time to act. The decision was made in whispers. In the back room of Prescott's store, Dr. Putnam, Jeremiah Prescott, Reverend Greenfield, and Thomas Thornberry sat around a table littered with ledgers, notes, and the damning journal. They spoke in hushed tones, each word carrying the weight of treason, not against the town, but against the man who had saved so many lives. "We wait any longer," Putnam said, "and there will be no one left to save." The plan was simple in outline, dangerous in execution. They would confront Samuel Hawthorne at the Thornberry home, arrest him quietly, and search his belongings for proof solid enough to convince even his most devoted followers. The Reverend would speak to those he still trusted in the congregation, preparing them for what might come. The constable, Marcus Hartwell, would be brought in to give the arrest a veneer of law. But they all knew the risk. Hawthorne had been watching them just as they had been watching him. March 15, 1847. Arrived gray and bitter. The snow had stopped, but the cold was sharp enough to burn the lungs. Just after sundown, the 6 men Putnam, Prescott, Greenfield, Hartwell, Thomas Thornberry, and Joshua Foresk, the innkeeper's brother-in-law, set out for the Thornberry house. From the road, they could see candlelight flickering in every window, casting restless shadows across the snow. The house seemed too quiet for a home with children, the silence broken only by a low, rhythmic sound. It was not quite singing, not quite chanting, and it pulsed in time with something that felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. Thomas stepped forward and knocked. The door opened to reveal Thomas Thornberry, but it was not the man they knew. His eyes had the pale, glassy gleam of Hawthorne's other patients. His movements were fluid, predatory. "Samuel has been teaching us about true survival," he said, and the voice was wrong-shaped by Hawthorne's cadence. Behind him, Grace stood in the hallway, her hands stained dark, her dress torn, her face calm in a way that was far more terrifying than rage or grief. Putnam pushed past them, driven by an urgency he could not contain. What he found in the main room rooted him to the floor. The Thornberry's dining table had been transformed into an altar. Chairs formed a perfect circle around it. On the table lay what at first seemed to be a butchered animal. Then his eyes adjusted, and he knew better. The cuts, the bones human, the remains were arranged with ritual care, alongside jars of organs labeled with Hawthorne's strange symbols. And there he was, Samuel Hawthorne, kneeling beside the table, a long blade in his hand. His coat was gone, his sleeves rolled, his movements precise and unhurried. "Ah, Doctor," Hawthorne said without looking up. "Perfect timing. We are at the final stage of young Mary's initiation. You see, understanding can only go so far, in theory. True comprehension requires participation." He rose, wiping the blade on a white cloth already mottled with dark stains. The families who vanished in the mountains did not die in vain. They became part of something greater, something enduring. Around the table sat Grace, Sarah, Mary, and William Thornbury, along with several neighbors who had come earlier that evening and never gone home. All wore the same vacant, hungry look, eyes tracking the newcomers with the focus of wolves scenting prey. "You've been drugging them," Putnam said, his voice low. "I've been freeing them," Hawthorne replied, the tone shifting into something like a sermon. "Civilization's taboos are nothing but chains. Waste is the true sin, and the human body is the perfect answer to the human need for life." Reverend Greenfield stepped forward, his voice sharp. "This is cannibalism, murder. You've turned these people into beasts." Hawthorne's smile was thin and cold. "Beasts, look at them. They are stronger than they have ever been. Their children will never fear the winter again, and they will teach others." The air in the room thickened. The converts' stillness broke in an instant. They surged forward, not with the clumsy rage of the untrained, but with the coordination of hunters. Thomas Thornberry, this twisted reflection of the man, moved faster than any of them expected, raking his nails across Constable Hunt's face before the man could draw his weapon. Grace produced a butcher's knife from beneath her skirt and advanced on the Reverend. The children were worst of all. Sarah darted low, forcing Prescott back. Mary bit at Putnam's wrist with the determination of a starving animal. William, barely 5, gripped a carving fork like a spear. It was chaos. Outs, the crash of furniture, the metallic temps of blood. These were neighbors, friends, patients, and yet there was no recognition in their eyes. Only hunger. Joshua managed to reach the door, shoving his way past two of the smaller converts and throwing himself into the snow. He ran for his horse, spurred it toward Bennington, and disappeared into the night. Whether he reached help, no one would ever know. Putnam fought his way clear, his arm bleeding, his mind seared with images he knew would never leave him. Prescott was close behind, panting, his coat torn. Behind them, the sounds of struggle and inhuman cries followed into the cold. By dawn, the alarm had spread. Those still untouched by Hawthorne's influence gathered with weapons, axes, old muskets, farm tools. The plan was no longer an arrest. It was a siege. But Hawthorne had prepared for this. By first light on March 16th, Milbrook was split in two. On one side stood those who had resisted Hawthorne's influence, farmers, trappers, and families who had not taken his medicines. On the other were the converts' neighbors, transformed into something colder, hungrier, and terrifyingly united. Dr. Putnam, arm-bound with a blood-soaked strip of linen, stood at the edge of the gathered townsfolk. The Reverend was beside him, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the Thornbury house. Behind its shuttered windows, movement flickered shapes that shifted with purpose. "They're ready for us," Putnam said. It wasn't a guess. The night's confrontation had proven something none of them had wanted to admit. Hawthorne had anticipated this moment. The Thornbury house was no longer just a home, it had been remade into a fortress. Barricades of furniture reinforced the windows. The front door was braced from within. Loopholes had been cut into the upper walls, and from them, the glint of metal musket barrels caught the weak morning light. Marcus Hartwell had not returned from the previous night's fight. Neither had Thomas Thornberry. Grace and the children were confirmed inside with Hawthorne, along with at least a dozen others. "We have to move quickly," Prescott urged, his voice hoarse. "If he slips away like he's done in other towns, he won't," the Reverend said, though there was no certainty in it. The first attempt to breach the front was met with a coordinated counterattack that stunned even the most seasoned hunters. The converts didn't fight like a mob, they fought like soldiers. Their movements were fluid, tactical, each action reinforcing another. A man with a musket would fire, and before the barrel cooled, two others would advance with knives to drive back the attackers. Inside, the defenders moved through the narrow halls with precision, using the layout of the house to funnel the attackers into choke points. Hawthorne's voice rose above the chaos at intervals, not shouting, but directing. Assured, as though he had orchestrated this months in advance. The first casualty came quickly. Samuel Cray, a lumberman, took a musket, ball to the chest as he tried to climb through a side window. The shot was clean, no wasted powder, no hesitation. By the time two others dragged him back, he was gone. Morale began to fray. These were not men trained for siege. They were farmers and shopkeepers, people whose lives had been bound by the rhythm of seasons, not the immediacy of survival combat. And inside that house were people they had known for years, faces from the market, from church, now glaring down at them with the predatory focus of wolves. Hawthorne's greatest weapon wasn't his blades or his guns, it was that recognition. More than once, an unconverted villager faltered at the last moment, unable to strike. The hesitation was costly. Those who hesitated often didn't come back from the doorway. The siege stretched into the night. The attackers took shifts, but there was no rest. Every creak of the snow outside, every whisper of wind against the walls felt like movement from within the house. Stopped by the second day, food and morale were both dwindling. The attackers had little in the way of ammunition. The defenders, disturbingly, seemed not to weaken from the smoke curling out of the Thornberry chimney. They knew the converts were eating, and from the metallic temps on the air, no one doubted what was in those pots. Put NHAM recorded everything in his journal between waves of assault. He wrote of the way the defenders' eyes tracked each movement from behind barricades, how the children darted like shadows, small enough to slip between furniture gaps and harry the attackers' flanks. He described the chilling coordination. Two converts could silently communicate with the flick of a hand or the tilt of a head. On the third morning, the townsfolk decided on one final push. They would break through or burn the house down around them. Snow was piled against the walls for cover, and lanterns of lamp oil were ready to be hurled through the upper windows. But when they rushed the front, they found nothing. The barricades still stood. The muskets were still propped in place, but the defenders were gone. Every room was empty, save for the evidence of hasty departure, blankets thrown aside, weapons missing from their racks, and bundles of supplies that had been there the night before. Down in the cellar, they found the real horror. Racks of preserved meat wrapped in the same strange hide as Hawthorne's coat, each piece labeled in that same spidery hand. Mixed among them were personal effects rings, lockets, a child's carved whistle. They followed tracks out the back, into the woods. The trail led north, into the mountains. After a mile, it split into a dozen smaller paths, each vanishing into the snow. They planned this, Prescott said bitterly. They were ready to disappear the moment it turned. The Reverend made the sign of the cross, or to spread. That night, Milbrook was a town of silence. Those who had survived the siege huddled in their homes, doors barred, guns close at hand. Snow drifted down, soft and steady, covering the tracks as though to erase the memory, but nothing could erase it. Not for those who had looked into the pale eyes of the converted and seen no trace of the neighbors they once knew. When March bled into April, the mountains loosened their grip. The ice along the Connecticut River cracked and shifted, groaning under the force of water pressing to be free. The snowpack shrank day by day, revealing not just the brown skeletons of last autumn's fields, but the darker truths winter had been keeping. The siege of Thornberry House had left Milbrook gutted, empty homes, a dwindling population, and the unshakable sense that part of the town had simply walked away into the mountains. Samuel Hawthorne was gone, so were Grace Thornberry and her children, Thomas, Constable Hartwell, and more than 24 others. The rest of the town carried on with the slow, mechanical persistence of the shell-shocked. They planted seed potatoes, repaired tools, and patched roofs because work was the only thing that made sense. Dr. Putnam did not stop working, but he also did not stop watching. He organized search parties as soon as the thaw made the high trails passable. His instincts told him Hawthorne's disappearance was not retreat, was relocation. On April 18th, a group led by Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott found the first cache. It was in a shallow cave beneath a ledge of granite, half hidden by fallen pine limbs. Inside, the walls were lined with more of that strange, armor-like hide. Stacked neatly were bundles of dried meat, each wrapped and labeled with the spidery symbols from Hawthorne's journal. Mixed among them were boots, coats, a silver pocket watch, a Bible with the name Margaret Fairchild inked on the flyleaf. A week later, another cache was found in a hollowed stump 3 miles northwest of town. This one held smaller parcels, as though meant for travel, ready for quick retrieval. Then came the most damning discovery, an abandoned camp high in the Green Mountains, far beyond any logging road. The snowmelt had turned the ground into thick, Mud, but still visible were the impressions of a dozen bedrolls, a central fire pit, and the scattered remains of crude wooden racks for drying meat. A rusted kettle still sat beside the ashes. What froze the searchers in place were the bones. Not deer, not bear. Human. The femurs were long and intact, scraped clean with a precision that suggested practiced hands. The skulls, those that remained, had been split neatly along the crown. As if to scoop out what lay inside, Putnam ordered the bones buried, but not before he made careful sketches and measurements in his journal. Evidence, he told Prescott, that no man of law can dismiss. Throughout April and May, more caches surfaced. Each one suggested the same conclusion. Hawthorne's operation had been far larger than Milbrook. These were not supplies gathered over a single winter, but stockpiles maintained for years, possibly decades. And then came the story from a trapper out of Chesterfield. He claimed he had stumbled upon a place in the high peaks where the smoke never stops. It was not a cabin, he said, but a settlement, half a dozen low huts, built of stone and hide. Their roofs blackened from constant fires. Whoever lived there had avoided the main trails, keeping two narrow goat paths that even the trapper hesitated to follow. When pressed for details, the man grew uneasy. They watched me the whole time, he said, from the tree line. Didn't speak, didn't come closer, just watched. Pale eyes, every one of them. Putnam organized an expedition to find the site, but the mountains were still treacherous with thaw-swollen streams and sudden slides of melting snow. Twice they lost the trail. Once they found what might have been a hut, its roof caved in, its floor littered with bones too far gone to identify. By early June, the expedition turned back, beaten by the terrain. The Reverend took it as divine intervention. Prescott took it as unfinished business. Putnam took it as confirmation of his worst fear, that Hawthorne's community had survived, and perhaps grown. That the evidence piled up in his notes, the identical preparation methods found in each cache, the repeating symbols, the way every site was placed within a day's travel of a sheltered water source. This was not the work of a lone madman. It was the work of an organized network. One night in late June, Prescott came to Putnam's home with a bundle of papers. Trade manifests, he said. From Bennington, Brattleboro, even Concord. Look here, goods going missing in winter, but not from storms or bandits. Specific items: iron tools, salt, cloth, preserved vegetables vanishing along certain routes. And you think? Putnam began. I know, Prescott said. It's them. They're not just taking food, they're building something, equipping it. The Reverend, when told, said the words aloud that both men had been avoiding. Colony. It was in July that the final proof came, if proof was the right word. A hunter from Rockingham brought in a bundle of strange hide to sell. When asked where he'd found it, he said it had been hanging in a tree, stretched on a frame halfway up a ravine. No trap, no sign of an animal, just the hide. Putnam examined it by lamplight. The texture was unmistakable, the same weatherproof material Hawthorne had worn when he arrived that February night. The doctor wrote in his journal that evening, he has not gone. He has only withdrawn to a place where our laws cannot reach him, and he is not alone. By August of 1847, Milbrook had learned to live with a shadow over it. The missing were still missing. The caches in the mountains remained untouched after discovery, as though the townsfolk feared that removing them might invite Hawthorne back. But news, strange, familiar news, began to drift in from beyond Vermont's borders. The first came from Hanover, New Hampshire, carried by a merchant who stopped at Prescott's store. He spoke of a man calling himself Dr. Samuel Black, who had appeared during a spring fever outbreak. The townsfolk said his remedies worked wonders. They also said that in the weeks after the fever broke, 2 families vanished, leaving behind their homes, livestock, and fully set tables. Prescott's blood ran cold at the details: the charismatic healer, the sudden vanishings, the pattern of arrival and exodus. A week later, a peddler from Massachusetts told a story of a Samuel White who had provided miraculous food during a blizzard. Said he'd trapped a moose big as a barn. The peddler chuckled, before realizing no one in the store was laughing. Well, anyhow, folks ate well, but after the thaw, half the young men were gone. Headed north, some said. Others just gone. Dr. Putnam began mapping each account on a large sheet of parchment. When the pins were placed, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, even as far as Maine, a grim truth emerged. The points formed a slow-moving arc, sweeping ever outward from Milbrook. The Reverend Greenfield called it a plague of belief, warning, in his sermons, that false shepherds lead their flocks into the jaws of the wolf. His congregation listened, but the warnings felt small against the size of the wilderness and the speed of rumor. By early September, the reports became harder to dismiss. In the town of Franconia, a man named Harlan Stone arrived after a landslide destroyed part of the main road. He treated the injured, stayed for 6 weeks, and then disappeared. 2 hunting parties vanished the same winter, and their cabins were found abandoned. Meat stores untouched, put NHAM, reading this in a letter from a fellow physician. Noted the same phrases Hawthorne had once used. The mountain provides waste, is the only sin. Then came the account from a mill town in Maine, a small place along the Androscoggin River. A traveling preacher told of a healer who came during a diphtheria outbreak, fed the sick from a stew so rich it could raise the dead, and left before spring thaw. When asked what the meat had been, the preacher said the man only smiled and replied, "You've never tasted its like before." The phrase was so like Hawthorne's that Putnam's hands trembled while writing it down. By autumn, the pattern had become undeniable. Hawthorne was not just surviving, he was replicating, whether through direct recruitment or by planting the seed of his philosophy in others. His methods were taking root in scattered settlements across the northeast. Prescott proposed sending riders to warn the affected towns, but the Reverend was cautious. "Men who are already eating at his table will not thank you for tipping it over," he said. "You'll find yourself marked as an enemy before you've spoken a word." And yet, warnings were sent coded letters to trusted contacts, urging them to watch for strangers bearing miraculous cures and sermons about nature's true law. By November, a report came back from Concord. A merchant who had taken the warning seriously had spotted a man matching Hawthorne's description at a winter market. He was dressed differently, his hair longer, his beard thicker, but the eyes, pale, unblinking eyes, were the same. When the merchant tried to follow him, Hawthorne slipped into the crowd and was gone. What troubled Putnam most was that the man had not been alone. With him were 2 women, both pallid, and a boy of perhaps 12 who walked with the same smooth, measured gait as his master. That winter, Milbrook itself saw fresh tracks in the snow along the northern ridge. They were human, barefoot, and spaced in such a way that suggested they had been made deliberately, not by accident. The tracks led toward the old pass, then vanished in a place where wind scoured the snow down to the stone. A few nights later, dogs barked in the lower valley. One farmer swore he saw a figure watching from the tree line, tall, motionless, with something slung over its shoulder. By the time he reached the spot, only the smell of wood smoke and a faint impression in the snow remained. Putnam began to suspect that Hawthorne or his disciples were testing the edges of the town again. He urged vigilance, though some argued that if Hawthorne had wanted them dead, they would be dead already. The doctor disagreed. "He doesn't kill without purpose. If he returns, it will be because he has decided this place can serve him again." In December, an early storm swept over the mountains. The snow muffled everything, drawing a white curtain over the town's edges. And in that stillness came a sound that many would later swear was not the wind. A long, low call, carrying from the high ridge down into the valley. It was not answered, not aloud, but those who heard it claimed they could feel, deep in their bones, that somewhere in the dark, the call had been received. By the turn of the year, Milbrook had become a town that listened more than it spoke. Every creak in a timber, every howl of wind over the ridge, every far-off crack of ice carried a weight of possibility. It might be nothing, or it might be the first sign that Hawthorne or what he had made was drawing near again. Dr. Putnam had taken to sleeping in his office, a rifle leaning against the desk, lantern always burning low. "It's easier to stay awake here," he told Prescott one morning as the 2 shared coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the stove. "In my own bed, I dream, and in those dreams, I hear him speaking." Prescott didn't ask what Hawthorne said in the dreams. He didn't want to know. The townsfolk had organized what they called the winter watch, pairs of men taking turns patrolling the edges of town, lanterns hooded, moving as quietly as possible. It was work that frayed the nerves. On moonless nights, the snow seemed to swallow sound, and every shadow looked like a figure. Reverend Greenfield joined the patrols, refusing to leave the work to younger men. "If evil returns, it will not find me sleeping," he said. His presence kept morale steady, though even he was seen glancing over his shoulder more than once. It was in late January when the watch first found signs. 2 patrolmen, Samuel Brigg and Henry Moore, were making their rounds along the northern ridge trail when they came across a small clearing sheltered by spruce. In the center was a circle of packed snow, as if something or someone had stood there for hours. There were no approach tracks, only the circle. Brigg swore he saw faint impressions in the snow that could have been toes, spaced far apart, barefoot. Moore, a man not given to superstition, admitted that the snow in the center seemed ever so slightly tinged with red, as though a drop or two of blood had fallen there and been quickly covered by fresh flakes. When word reached Putnam, he went to see it himself. By then the wind had scoured the clearing nearly clean, but he found one thing the others had missed: a length of thin, cured hide, no longer than a man's hand, caught in the lower branches of a spruce. He pocketed it without a word. The watch doubled their rounds after that. Yet the unease did not come from seeing too much, it came from seeing too little. No more tracks, no strange fires in the hills, no sign of the missing. And still, the feeling persisted that eyes were on them. In early February, a snowstorm trapped the town indoors for 2 days. On the third morning, the wind dropped to nothing. The air was so still it seemed unnatural. That was when the sound came again, a long, low call from the north ridge, not unlike a hunting horn, though deeper, wetter. This time, several men were close enough to hear what followed, a faint answering call from far to the east. That night, dogs barked and howled until dawn. One was found the next morning dead in its yard, no wound visible, its eyes open wide as if it had seen something that stopped its heart. Reverend Greenfield urged the townsfolk to hold to prayer, but Putnam began drawing up a contingency. People could gather if an attack came, who would guard the children, how to signal retreat. Prescott, meanwhile, gathered supplies that could be moved quickly. If they come again, he told the doctor, it won't be the same fight. They'll know every weakness from before. The fear was not unfounded. Mid-February brought another sign, this one too deliberate to be dismissed. The morning after, a clear, windless night, the townsfolk woke to find a trail of prints in the main street, bare feet, long strides, evenly spaced. The trail went from the north road straight through the center of town, past the church, and ended at the south road. Whoever had made them had walked in perfect silence through sleeping Milbrook. A watch followed the prints until they vanished on the frozen river. There, caught in a seam of ice, was a scrap of cloth deep brown, stiff with frozen blood. Putnam studied it that evening, comparing the weave to samples from Hawthorne's coat. The match was exact. That night, the dreams came back. 2 more. Then one person, Mary Carter, a widow, woke screaming about a table laid in the snow, and hands passing plates that never emptied. Old Jacob Reed claimed he saw Grace Thornbury in his sleep, standing at the foot of his bed, smiling, holding a steaming bowl. By the end of February, no one in Milbrook doubted it. The winter had brought them close again, and the thaw would bring them closer still. March arrived not with the gentleness of spring, but with a slow and dangerous unbinding. The snow softened into slush, streams swelled and churned, and the ice on the river cracked in long, echoing groans that carried through the valley like distant cannon fire. For Milbrook, the thaw meant 2 things. The watch could patrol farther without snowshoes, and whatever had been moving in the mountains all winter now had clear paths to the town. On the 2nd day of March, Henry Moore returned from the Northern Ridge Patrol with a face pale enough to frighten the children. They're moving, he said simply. Not just 1 or 2 dozens, he described seeing them from a rise, figures in tattered coats and hides, slipping between the trees in single file. Some carried bundles. Others dragged sledges. A few moved on all fours, their pale faces lifting only briefly toward the weak sunlight, before vanishing into shadow again. Dr. Putnam listened without interruption, then turned to Prescott. It's a relocation. They're shifting position for the spring. That night, the watch spotted a fire far up the eastern slope. The flames were low and steady, the kind used by hunters who didn't want their smoke seen. By morning it was gone, but fresh tracks in the valley snow told the real story. They weren't avoiding the town, they were skirting it, moving deliberately toward the old southern pass. Reverend Greenfield called a meeting in the church. The pews filled with the remaining townsfolk, their faces drawn tight with fear and sleeplessness. We cannot live with this shadow forever, the Reverend said, voice trembling only slightly. We must decide. Do we confront them before they settle again, or do we fortify and hope they pass by? The debate split the room. Farmers argued for defense walls, barricades, a signal system. Younger men wanted to strike first, to cut them off in the pass. Women spoke of gathering the children and fleeing to larger towns. Through it all, Putnam sat silent until the Reverend asked his opinion. We are not equipped for an assault in the mountains, he said, but neither can we wait for them. To choose the moment, we need information where they're going, how many there are, and whether Hawthorne himself is with them. Without that, we'll be fighting in the dark. By mid-March, the scouting began. 2-man teams moved in daylight along the ridges, avoiding direct contact. It was on such a mission that Samuel Brigg and Prescott found the camp. It was in a hollow, shielded by pines, with a small stream running through the center. There were 8 shelters, simple lean-tos of hide and branch. But what froze the men in place was the structure in the middle. A table, built of rough timbers, sat on a platform of packed earth. Upon it were dozens of bones, clean white, arranged in patterns like strange letters. Around the table, the snow had been stained a dull brown, and the smell that rose in the warming air was faint but unmistakable. Prescott was about to step closer when a voice drifted from the trees. You've found our spring table. They turned to see a woman step from the shadows. She wore a patchwork coat, and her pale eyes fixed on them with no surprise at all. Her hair was braided with strips of leather, and she carried a long knife at her hip. Grace, Prescott said before he could stop himself. She smiled faintly. It's good to be remembered. There was no rush, no threat, just the measured presence of someone who knew she was not in danger. Samuel sends his regards, she said. He says the town still has strong bones. We will not waste them. Briggs' hand twitched toward his musket, but Grace tilted her head, and from the trees behind her came the sound of movement, soft, padded steps. Pale faces appeared between the trunks, one after another, until a dozen stood watching. Prescott swallowed hard. You could have killed us already. We could, Grace agreed. But Samuel prefers invitations over raids. He will come when the ground is soft enough to bury the winter dead. She stepped back into the trees, and as she did, the watchers melted away with her, leaving the clearing empty except for the table of bones. Briggs wanted to destroy it, but Prescott stopped him. If we touch it, they'll know we're frightened. Better to leave it as they left it. When they returned to Milbrook, the news spread quickly. Some took it as a warning, others as proof that Hawthorne intended to take the town by intimidation, rather than outright attack. But Putnam saw something worse in Grace's words. He's waiting for the right season, the doctor said, and when he comes, it won't be for a meal. It will be to plant himself here for good. That night, a cold rain began to fall, hastening the thaw. The river swelled, carrying chunks of ice down toward the lowlands, and somewhere beyond the ridges, Samuel Hawthorne was waiting for the ground to soften. The last of the snow retreated into the shadows of stone walls and deep woods, leaving the ground slick with mud and the air heavy with the scent of thawing earth. It was late March when Hawthorne finally stepped back into Milbrook. No one saw him arrive. There was no warning cry, no rush of boots on frozen ground. He was simply there, standing in the square by the dry fountain, coat buttoned high, pale eyes steady on the first person to notice him. It was Sarah Briggs, Samuel's wife, carrying a basket of potatoes from the cellar. She froze mid-step, one hand gripping the handle so tight her knuckles whitened. Hawthorne inclined his head as if greeting an old friend. Mrs. Briggs, he said evenly, you've kept well. Within minutes, word rippled through the town. Doors cracked open, curtains shifted, and by the time Dr. Putnam and Prescott reached the square, a loose ring of townsfolk had gathered and tense. Hawthorne looked unchanged from the winter before. The same strange hide coat, the same precise stillness in every movement. Only his beard was fuller, streaked with the faintest threads of silver. You've been busy, Prescott said. Hawthorne smiled faintly. I've been building. The mountains have taught me much, and I've come to share what I've learned. Putnam's voice was sharp. We've seen what you share, and yet, Hawthorne replied, you're still here, alive, breathing. Feddy let the words hang in the damp air. I've no interest in bloodshed today. I've come with an offer. A murmur ran through the crowd. The Reverend stepped forward, Bible in hand. The only offer you can make is to leave and never return. Hawthorne's pale gaze settled on him. Reverend Greenfield, you speak for God. I speak for the earth beneath your feet, and the earth is tired of seeing you scrape at it for scraps. While winter starves your children, I can change that permanently. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. Unfolding it, he revealed strips of dark, cured meat, thick, glossy, and faintly aromatic even. In the cold spring air, enough for every household, he said, and more waiting in the mountains. You will never go hungry again. No plow, no drought, no failed harvest will touch you. No one moved. The memory of last winter hung between them, the siege, the disappearances, the caches in the hills. What is it? Someone asked from the back. Hawthorne's smile deepened. It is sustenance, the finest you'll taste. The same that has kept my people strong while the snow buried your fields. Prescott stepped closer, and the cost. Hawthorne didn't hesitate. A tithe, not in gold, not in land, in people. The lonely, the unwanted, the outcast. Those with no ties to bind them here. They will join us, and in return, you will thrive. A gasp broke from the crowd. Reverend Greenfield's face flushed red. You speak of human life as if it were barter. It is barter, Hawthorne said. calmly. Everything is. You trade your own lives for coin in the mill. You trade your strength for food in the field. I offer you a better exchange, one that ends hunger forever. Putnam's voice cut through the murmurs. And what happens to those you take? They are welcomed, fed, freed from the smallness of this place. His eyes moved over the crowd, pausing on familiar faces. Some of them have already chosen. Grace sends her greetings. The name dropped into the square like a stone in still water. Several heads turned toward the Thornbury house, empty since the siege. Prescott's jaw tightened. You're wasting your breath, Hawthorne. We're not giving you anyone. Hawthorne studied him for a long moment. You say that now. But the next hard winter will speak louder than you can, and I will listen when it comes. He wrapped a bundle of meat and set it on the fountain's rim, a gift for you to remember. Then he turned and walked toward the northern road. No one tried to stop him. The crowd parted as if by instinct, their eyes fixed on his back. When he was gone, the Reverend stepped forward and picked up the bundle, holding it as though it might burn him. We destroy this, he said. But Putnam stopped him. No, we keep it, as evidence, as a reminder of what's waiting beyond those ridges. That night, no one in Milbrook slept easily. Some lay awake imagining the taste of the meat, others trying to banish the thought entirely. A few wondered, in the privacy of their own minds, whether Hawthorne's offer had been madness or salvation. The morning after Hawthorne's visit, Milbrook woke divided. The mud streets carried more than footprints. Now they carried quiet arguments, broken off when someone passed too close. Some dismissed the offer outright, vowing they would never trade lives for food. Others, their voices low, wondered if it was truly so different from sending young men to war or the mills, where death claimed them all the same. Hunger, they reasoned, was just another battlefield. Dr. Putnam saw the fracture widening by the day. Farmers lingered too long outside the store, speaking in small knots, glancing toward the mountains. Mothers watched their children as if counting them, and at night, lights burned later than usual, curtains drawn tight. It was on the third day that a man named Elias Crower, widower with no surviving kin, vanished from his cabin on the southern edge of town. His door was left ajar, his few belongings untouched. The only tracks led toward the river where the ice had broken away. The Reverend called it a kidnapping. Prescott thought otherwise. If he went willing, it's worse than I thought, he told Putnam. 2 nights later, a teenage girl named Lorna Bell disappeared from her family's farm. Her parents claimed she'd gone to bed after supper. By morning, her blankets were neatly folded, her boots gone. In the snow by the barn, they found a single bare footprint. Fear shifted into suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other in the street, wondering who might be considering the offer. The watch doubled their patrols, but the absences continued more in the space of a week. Each gone without struggle, without a trace, as if the mountains themselves had swallowed them whole. On the 7th night, the watch spotted movement near the old southern pass. Lanterns bobbing, a small group moving, in single file. Prescott and Brigg took a rifle apiece and followed at a distance. The moon was high enough to throw silver across the snow, revealing what they'd feared: Grace Thornbury at the head of the column, with Hawthorne himself walking behind, his coat dark against the white. They moved without haste, guiding their charges 5 townsfolk, each with a bundle on their back toward the ridge. When Grace glanced over her shoulder, her eyes found Prescott's in the dark. She did not look away. Prescott raised his rifle, but Hawthorne's voice carried across the snow before he could fire. Kill me, and they'll still come. This is only the first harvest. The words struck harder than a bullet. Prescott hesitated, finger tightening on the trigger, and in that pause, the group vanished into the trees. By the time he and Brigg reached the pass, there was nothing but the hiss of wind through the pines and the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from somewhere far ahead. Back in town, the Reverend called for action: a full party to storm the mountains, burn the camps, end the threat. Putnam, exhausted from sleepless nights, argued for patience. If we go in blind, we'll lose more than we save, he said. We don't know their numbers, their weapons, their paths. But the town had reached its breaking point. At dawn, a dozen men gathered at the square, rifles in hand. Prescott was among them. The Reverend blessed them, though his voice shook, and Putnam watched from the steps of his office, knowing he could not stop them. The hunting party left in silence. They never came back. Weeks passed with no bodies, no word, no returned rifles. Only once did a sign appear, a single bundle left at the edge of the northern ridge, wrapped in hide. Inside was enough meat to feed the town for a week, along with a note in Hawthorne's hand. The mountain provides, the wasteful perish. By late April, Milbrook had thinned again, not from raids, not from illness, but from choices made quietly. In the night, a man here, a woman there, gone before dawn. The watch stopped counting. One evening, as the sun bled over the western hills, Putnam stood on the edge of town and saw a figure watching from the ridge. Too far to be certain, but he knew the shape, the stillness. Hawthorne. The figure raised a hand, not in threat, but in greeting, and then turned, disappearing into the trees. Milbrook would survive another season, but everyone who remained understood the truth. Survival was no victory, not while the mountains still hid a table that was never empty, and in the silence after dark, when the wind shifted, some swore they could hear it, the faint call from the high peaks, waiting for the next answer.